my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel. I'm going to talk about the top 10-ish books that I thought were the worst for me, for my tastes. Not empirically, but as close as it comes. Just kidding. So my number one worst book, probably to no one's shock if they've been watching the channel, is 1Q84. And again, with these books, I'm not going to bother saying the author's name or how, if I remember how I consumed it and stuff. I'm just going to put the info at the bottom, and the image will tell you if it's an audiobook or not, as well as the information below. 1Q84 was terrible. I read it with Miss Reads a Lot, Sandy, and we propelled ourselves quite quickly through it, which was good. Some parts were not bad. Like the beginning of the book, I was optimistic about it, but it slowly devolves into very literally masturbatory in some ways, and in others just merely self-indulgent. But the last book out of 1-4 being collated into it is terrible. It's a very bad. The ending is very subjective, which I usually don't mind, but because most of it is subjective, for some reason it just feels very lackluster. The final arc with the female protagonist is abysmal, maybe the worst I've ever encountered. Truly boring, truly boring. And yeah, I don't think it does what people think that it does. It's one of those cases where it's such a long book, about 1,000 pages, that when people get through it, in a very self-congratulatory kind of way, they have a passing fancy for the book, I think. If they made it through the book, it must mean that they liked it a lot because they were able to get through it. And there's this weird thing that happens with maximalist books, of which this is probably the worst maximalist thing I've ever consumed. And I've consumed The Brothers Karamazov this year. Did I think it was the worst book? No, but I think it was the biggest letdown because it's always called the best book that has ever been written and everybody loves it. It's not. It was a 3-star read. I tried 3 different translations. I tried it on audio and on the physical page. It just ain't it. Nabokov was right. The other book that I disliked quite a bit, I read this with Mark Nash, The Candy House, the sequel to The Goon Squad. I think it is dysfunctional as a sequel. I think that what works very well about The Goon Squad is her passion for the characters, her empathy for them, and her characterization of their quirks and what make them a little bit different. And none of that makes it through in The Candy House. There are 2 good short stories in it, and it feels very vindictive towards the first cast for some strange reasons, actually. The themes are not as interesting. The world building is very literary in that she has a concept that is introduced but then never interrogates it, nor does the world building, nor actually extrapolates it so that the world makes sense around it. It is just injected into the fiction. The Savage Detectives, terrible book. It was so hypersexual, again, very masturbatory. It says something about youth, I think, and male culture at that time, but it is entirely uncompelling for me. Maybe it's because I'm ace, I don't know. But boy, all this guy thinks about is poetry and sex, and it's not rendered in a compelling way whatsoever. It's not interesting at all. And I ended up DNFing that book, and it's another one that makes lots of people's masterpiece lists, must-read lists. The Humans. I use this as a standard pejorative now, basically. It is so prescriptive, it is laughable in its way of trying to get people to think about the theme, I guess, but also the conclusion to the theme. You should be thinking X when you consume this story because Y, X, Z happened. And it's just very fumbling, I thought. And I just don't like prescriptive works anyway. So I was always going to grind up against this. I knew this since The Midnight Library, which again, I kind of use as a standard pejorative these days, where if it is kind of like The Midnight Library or kind of like The Humans, I know that I will dislike it because it is not allowing the reader to have enough intelligence to come to their own conclusions. And the story is so solipsistic and so constructed as to only do those things that I can not take anything away from it that is pleasant, basically. Other than I finished the book, which was amazing. The Island of Missing Trees, I did not like this book because I thought that it was at odds with its own sort of theme. It's talking about colonization, it's talking about immigration, refugees, the story of culture, and yet it has a talking tree that's anthropomorphized, and in so doing, when you anthropomorphize a tree, I feel like you're, in a way, like replicating the nature of man or you're replicating how men think about nature onto nature itself and projecting a kind of colonist viewpoint onto something anyway in order to make a point about colonizing, which is, it just doesn't work for me. Like, it kind of breaks my brain a little bit. Not because I don't understand it, but because I think that it isn't taking into account all of the ways in which man destroys nature, most of the time inadvertently, but then to then give voice to nature in a way that is so, I find, disrespectful and not thought through. I think it kind of ruins the entire book for me. To Paradise, I had high hopes for this, but the first book was really compelling, I thought, and very well done to some degree. All of these stories go off into paradise. It does not have any catharsis. It just leads to a certain point and ends, and then you need to extrapolate it for yourself. The characters have the same names, despite them. There's not even that much connective tissue to suggest that it's like the same world even. And the second book was majorly boring, I found. The third book was quite strong again, but because it is so uneven, because the connective tissue, again, this is a sci-fi literary work in which it injects concepts that it does not feel like it needs to do world building around or interrogate soundly or make the world even make sense, even though it is a 800-page book. It just feels like it's another effort from a literary source that has no idea what genre they're actually writing in. They just have a notion and they want to inject it for whatever purposes, and that notion has cascading effects on the actual craft of the book that they don't take into consideration, and it ruins the whole thing for me. Journey to the End of the Night, laughably bad. Another best of book on nihilism and all that kind of crap. The problem with this is that the character so much so is into moral relativism that the stakes feel fake. The rendering of things actually doesn't matter, because if you don't believe that anything has ramifications, he barely even acknowledges consequences. He sleeps around. He's not an interesting character. He's a caricature of a character who's not doing interesting things at all. He is being a pubescent Holden Caulfield, except he's an old person or older person who advocates for leaving the war and does so, and then just kind of goes on this solipsistic bender through Europe, and it's absolutely forgettable trash. Stranger in a Strange Land, again, very it's so old that it kind of shows its own ass. He's sort of like trolling every Western culture, from beliefs to philosophy to a lot of different sort of standards viewpoints through the lens of this like a very annoying erudite man and an alien who interacts with him, who's ostensibly the protagonist but not really, and through this notion that he puts in it with it, like a stranger in a strange land, he's able to interrogate all these different things and basically just have an excuse to take a dump on everything, except that he does so in such a crappy way that it is so misandrist and misogynistic at the same time that it's laughable. Like, again, kind of like Journey Through Night, he is not actually taking a stand. He just enjoys crapping on everything and having like thought experiments that go nowhere, or even have like a real plot, really. It's not good. Endgame. This is just the worst book that I've ever consumed, and it's commercial fiction. It is the finale to a long-ish series, 5 books. It's pretty long. David Baldacci, and he just, I don't know, like rolled his own plot. The characters don't make sense. What is established about them previously is kind of wiped away. It's bombastic. It's stupid. It's like if a studio asked writers to come up with all these like really cool things that would happen in a book, but none of them make sense, except it's a novel, and it's not a movie, it's not a script. It's, people, I think I've even seen that people like refuse to believe that he even wrote it or something, which is unfortunate. I wish that I knew that when I had that series, because I have all those books now, because I got them in a bin, and to a bin they shall return. Emergency. This is how I discovered that I hate pastoralism, I guess. Is that the right word? Pastoralism, whatever. Pastoral writing, not for me. This, even conjoined with like a horror aspect, literally is just spinning its wheels the entire time. I could not latch on to any interesting thing. It's about a woman who's telling a story in the pandemic of her life, but she's recontextualizing it through the lens of the COVID, like kind of characterizing it in those horror components that I mentioned, but it doesn't actually resonate. It doesn't clip along with the plot, of course, because it's pastoral, and there's nothing of interesting that is occurring whatsoever. And I was so bored out of my mind. I attempted to read this, I think, 4 evenings. Every time it just put me to sleep, and eventually I just put it aside. Beneath the Scarlet Sky is the last one, which is self-published nonsense. I couldn't make it through even 50 pages of this, I think. The perspective doesn't make sense. It's completely broken. The prologue, in which he is discussing, the actual author is inserting himself in the prologue to discuss how the book was created, which is not a prologue. And then he sort of like, he obviously knows the perspectives is broken, and in trying to justify it by saying that this story is both how it was told to him by this little boy, but also how he imagines it and characterizes it. So it slips in and out of like first and third perspective, but then supplies information that nobody could have possibly known, including that boy who's telling that story ostensibly. And yeah, it just wasn't going anywhere. The writing was terrible. The pacing was bad. The flow was bad. The grammar was bad. The prose were bad. I don't know why it was a hit. Those are the worst books of 2022. And there were more that could have been on this list. Let me tell you, this was actually a little bit difficult to condense. So yeah, hopefully this year is a little bit better, and there's only like, 3 needling books for this year, and not, potentially 30 that I narrow down to like 10 or 11 or whatever. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a good reading year, and I will see you later. Bye.